Hello, we are together today at a rare moment, a pause between two ages, caught between the future and the past. A steady force has faded and what's coming next is yet to reveal itself in full. Today we'll hear from three former Prime Ministers for whom Queen Elizabeth was a trusted confidant, maybe even a friend. But as one era closes, another opens. A new king, and don't forget, a new Prime Minister too. Change comes gradually, then suddenly, after all. A fanfare. A transfer. From queen to king, from mother to son. Sadness and memory.
Even as we grieve, we give thanks for this most faithful life.
The clamour stills. And a new sound comes.
God save our gracious King, God live forever.
The end of one era, the journey to the next begun. I've been speaking to David Cameron, Theresa May and Gordon Brown. And what was the view of the Queen from across the pond? We'll hear from JFK's daughter, now Ambassador Caroline Kennedy, who played with the royals as a girl. And with me for this whole programme today, King Charles' close friend and former Conservative MP, Nicholas Soames, Alison Phillips, the editor of the Daily Mirror, and Baroness Amos, the diplomat and Labour peer. Welcome to you all. Now, good morning. So much has changed in a week and there is so much to come. I want to show you straight away what's happening at Balmoral right now, from where in an hour the coffin of Her Majesty the Queen will begin its journey to London, starting with the long 6-hour drive from the castle to Edinburgh and the Palace of Holyrood House. A journey that will be recorded and shown forever, and we'll bring that to you here on the BBC throughout the day with a special programme. And just as today's newspapers are marking this moment, it feels like one of those days when you want to buy one of those editions and maybe store it away for the rest of your life. Let's take a look at some historic front pages. A beautiful image of the Queen, Her late Majesty, there on the front of the Sunday Times. Several of the newspapers, perhaps not surprisingly, picking out those surprise images yesterday of the next generation. Harry and Meghan appearing by surprise at Windsor Castle with the Prince and Princess of Wales. Extraordinary front pages there. Welcome to all of you here this morning. Nicholas Soames, what stands out for you from the papers this morning?
Well, I think, Laura, the very powerful imagery of the late Queen. I think these newspapers have carried the most wonderful portraits of her through her reign in the last 2 days. And I'm particularly struck, there's a beautiful one in the Sunday Times of the Queen dressed in the state dress of the Order of the Thistle, taken actually at Balmoral against the Highland background. It's a very moving picture and kind of signifies her love of Scotland, where she sadly died. But I think they are very powerful, these images. And record such an extraordinary and long life. Alison Phillips, what did you take away from this morning? I mean, there's so much to choose from, isn't there?
There really is, but I thought the picture of the family coming out at the gates of Balmoral yesterday was particularly poignant because although obviously down in London at that point there was the ceremony of the accession, at the same time we have to remember that there is a family in grief. It's a very personal thing, and I think her granddaughters, Beatrice, Eugenie and Zara, all moved to tears, and Sophie Wessex, who she had a very close relationship, looked terribly upset. And I think
we can see her there at Balmoral.
Yeah, and I think amidst all the ceremony and the idea that the whole country really wants to join in this point of mourning, we have to remember it's a very personal family event as well.
Baroness Amos, what struck you?
Really the crowds. And I was there yesterday, actually, outside Buckingham Palace, and people from across the world, people from across Britain, the children, and it's all about continuity and change. It's wanting to pay their respects to the late Queen, but also wanting to welcome our new King. And there are some marvellous pictures in the newspapers, but St James's Palace, which I was there for the Accession Council, I saw people there as well. People just materialised out of nowhere. It was so hard to get through, but the patience that people were showing, I think it's absolutely extraordinary.
I was there yesterday too at the mall, and it was absolutely packed, but there was many smiles along with the sadness, and it did feel people were genuinely, from every generation, every background, coming together, and that happens so rarely. But one of the other things that was so striking yesterday was the surprise appearance of Harry and Meghan alongside Prince and Princess of Wales at Windsor Castle. Nicholas Soames, I know you know the royal family well. They've obviously had a terrible agony over the fractured relationship. What did you think when you saw those images yesterday?
Well, I thought it was a very powerful picture. And, you know, as you said, Laura, grief in a family brings people together. And I think it's worth remembering that the royal family, I mean, it's only 18 months ago that Prince Philip died, and now the Queen has died, and they, I think, must be, you know, stricken with grief. And I think Alison is quite right. I mean, it was very, very touching to see the rest of the family outside the gates of Balmoral, obviously deeply moved by the tributes. And I always think it's so striking at moments of grief how the human face is so dignified in the face of grief. And you looked at those crowds in Buckingham Palace, it was this mixture of grief and being there together, corporate sense of being together.
Well, it's interesting you say a corporate sense, and maybe also a deliberate sense from the royals, do you think, to show that unity yesterday, where there has, we know, been such despair and unhappiness between the two brothers?
Well, whatever the reason for it, I think all of us can be very pleased to see it. And I thought that the King, in his address, made very clear of his great love and affection for Prince Harry and Meghan, and that was the outward and visible sign of that happening, and I think that's very good news.
Alison, do you think
the difficult thing here, Laura, is that this is both really personal and it's also public. We've all been through these moments with our families where we've had, you know, tragic loss, the pain, the grief, and there is a coming together. There is a putting aside of differences at that moment in time. Of course, we all hope that this will continue, but I think it was something that we were all very, very pleased to see yesterday.
Alison, briefly.
Yes, I think the word came from Prince of Wales. Sorry, that this was a show of unity, and let's hope that it's not just a show. There is actually a sense of unity.
Clearly, a very, very big gesture. That took place yesterday that we all witnessed, and clearly really delighted the crowds to see them coming out together. Now, thank you all very much. From now, shortly, we'll be touching on some other stories making the news this morning as well. But with power transferred, one of the most important relationships the King will have is with his Prime Minister. Liz Truss will be the first to undertake the weekly ritual of the audience with him, as it's properly known. And in the last couple of days, I've spent some time with 3 people who've done the job. 3 people who were in the room yesterday when King Charles formally took the throne. Here are David Cameron, Theresa May and Gordon Brown on the kind of king that Charles might be.
Well, it was a huge privilege to be there because this event has happened in one form or another since Anglo-Saxon times. So you felt you were part of an extraordinary historical event.
Everybody saw at the Accession Council all the former Prime Ministers, one of the most exclusive clubs in the world, having the odd whisper and word to each other. What were you talking about?
Well, the number of ex-Prime Ministers is growing. I said to Boris,
quite rapidly.
It's the club that no one wants to join and you never get to leave. But there's always a good sort of camaraderie amongst us. It's interesting because often they were your principal political opponent. I was up against Tony Blair and then Gordon Brown, and now when we meet at these things, it's much more talk about how the children or grandchildren and sort of discussion of those sorts of things, rather than anything more profound. So that was mostly what the banter was about, I think, when we were chatting and welcoming in Boris, our newest member.
Did he look happy to be welcomed to that club?
Well, he was looking happy. So I don't know if he was happy to join the club, but he was looking happy.
Of course, one of the great things of our constitution is as soon as one monarch passes, another monarch accedes to the throne. So is that continuation of somebody who is there, who will get to know the issues, who will have experience, and of course King Charles, as Prince Charles, has been, if you like, on in waiting for this role.
I had audiences with Prince Charles when Queen Elizabeth II was still on the throne, because he wanted to start thinking about how to conduct those audiences. And from what I saw, he will be brilliant at that job, brilliant at listening, brilliant at asking questions, giving wise advice and sage counsel. I mean, this has probably been the longest apprenticeship in history, and he knows so much about so many subjects. And like his mother, he is a superb diplomat. I saw him in action at Commonwealth Heads of Government meetings, and he knows every leader personally, he interacts with them brilliantly. The soft power that the British monarch brings to help a Prime Minister and a government with all those international relations, it was obviously outstanding under Queen Elizabeth II. I think you'll see that Charles III will be a very worthy successor in that regard.
What's he like? I mean, your paths will have crossed, and as you said yourself, he's somebody who has been in public life for many decades before acceding the throne. What's he like?
He's a very thoughtful individual, but has his mother's sense of fun as well.
A nice person, and I think you would enjoy meeting him, and I think you would enjoy meeting him and the Queen Consort Camilla. But obviously, this is a completely different job from being the heir apparent and from being the Prince of Wales. And I think quickly he'll understand that he has responsibilities right across the world.
Well, the first thing I'd say is he's extremely intelligent and charming. My wife always said, when we had to go to one of those banquets or dinners or big meetings, she always said, I hope I'm sitting next to Prince Charles. He's the best person to sit next to. He's the most charming company. There's no one who is better at putting you at your ease and more charming companion to talk to, and that's her words. So he's immensely charming. He's highly intelligent. While it is incredibly sad that we're mourning the loss of our greatest monarch, I think the constitutional monarchy is in great hands.
When he was still Prince of Wales, though, he did make representations on many different causes. Did he ever write you any of those famous letters that he did as Prince of Wales, pushing for various of his issues?
Well, of course, and I had many conversations with Prince Charles. I do respect his views on the environment. He's been a leader in this. But I think what he was saying when he spoke to the country on Friday was that he was going to set aside his charities and his interests in favour of concentrating 100% on the duties of the monarch, and I think that will involve a huge amount of travelling. And I think that will involve travelling not just in Britain, but across the world. And I think we've got to understand that that is a good thing for Britain, that we have a monarch that is prepared to be outward-looking, prepared to speak to countries right across the world.
I never felt he tried to influence me improperly in any way. I think that the heir to the throne has a perfect right to have an interest in issues like the environment, like preserving wildlife, like his interest in the built environment. In fact, many of the causes he took up back in the 60s and 70s might have looked rather fringe. He picked his subjects superbly, became an expert in things like climate change and the environment long before politicians were talking about them, and I think his pursuit of them was entirely justified. I think it's entirely right that the heir to the throne can discuss things with politicians and write them letters and all the rest of it. Why not? And in fact, I don't see why there should be any public concern about that. In fact, my view was that those letters should remain private.
And do you think that the monarchy will need to adapt?
I think what Prince Charles has already indicated is that the monarchy is going to be smaller. It's going to be more like a Scandinavian monarchy in future, I think, but not in a bad way, in the sense that more informal. I think he stopped as he entered Buckingham Palace and talked to people in the crowd, and that was a signal he was sending, that he wanted people to feel he was approachable and he was not going to be absent from the public or alternatively be unapproachable.
if you look at the monarchy and the royal family, they have been steadily evolving a different approach, a different way of doing things over time. And I'm sure that King Charles will continue to take that forward. And of course, he is a different person, and he may want to change things in some ways. But I think critically, as the Queen did, any change in the way things are done would be done gradually and very carefully.
And beyond that visibility, I suppose, in our communities, in our towns, villages and cities, what do you think the public, I suppose, have the right to expect from the new king?
Well, I think they will expect that sense of continuity, but also that sense of recognising that the world is changing, has been changing, continues to change, and so a willingness to evolve alongside that. And I think what they will hope and what they will get is that deep interest in people, which Her Majesty had. And King Charles, I believe, has that too. A deep concern for people and wanting to understand people's interests, people's circumstances, different communities around the country, and translating that actually into the role that he has as a monarch.
I think the most important thing they have a right to expect is service and duty. That is what Queen Elizabeth II absolutely personified. She was good to her word of what she said as a young princess, aged 25 in South Africa. My life, be it long or short, will be dedicated to serving you. But it's more than that, because I think her brilliance was that it was not just service and duty. It was a profound understanding of the role, of the institution, of the history, but above all, a profound understanding of the British people, of the people she was giving that service and duty to. And I think it was because she had that understanding that she was so able to reign so brilliantly for so long and to adapt, often very subtly, to the needs of a changing country. Service, duty and understanding, and he's got all those things.
Well, we'll hear more of the Prime Minister's memories and recollections of the Queen a bit later in the programme. But Sir Nicholas, what kind of king do you think Charles will be? You're one of the few people in the country who know him very well.
Well, I think that he is in an extraordinary position because he's kind of a link with the past and to the future. Mm-hmm. He has a profound, I think David Cameron put it very well, he has a profound understanding of people. The work of the Prince's Trust that he's done has helped over a million people. Mm-hmm. Hundreds of thousands of people put into new jobs. I think his understanding of what goes on the ground in this country is a great deal more thorough than people would even understand possibly, and therefore, and his manner, his whole manner is sympathetic, understanding and empathy. And I think we saw that with the crowd outside Buckingham Palace yesterday.
Well, it's interesting, Alison, that he's chosen already twice to go on a walkabout to speak to the crowds. Even the first time he arrived back at Buckingham Palace, straight out of the car to go and greet people. And yet, over the years, he has sometimes seemed, compared to his mother, a more remote figure, whereas we know that, the Queen was held in such affection. How do you think he'll make that transition? You know, we can see him there outside Clara's house last night, smiling, joking, even with the crowd and accepting condolence.
Well, I think this is interesting as well, of course, because his mother, in her final decade really, was unable to do the foreign tours as much, and she wasn't able to go out and meet people as much, obviously because she was into her 90s by that point. So we're going to have a much younger monarch who will be much more sort of engaged and out there, and as we know, he's incredible at the tours that he does. But in terms of how he will reign, I just thought the speech on Friday evening was utterly amazing, and that he managed to take the whole national conversation really from that point of mourning through to really being able to imagine him as our next king. And I thought the lines that he used about endeavouring to serve with, I think, loyalty, respect and love, if you look at those words, it's quite fascinating. Respect, I think that's respect that he understands how different people are now, how society has changed, and the emphasis on the individual, and it's with respect for those and with love. And I thought I think that's the key point.
Do you think that speech might have taken some of your readers a little bit by surprise?
Yes. I think perhaps it has, but in a good way.
What about, can I add to that? Because I think there is something about, we know that he cares about things. We know that he cares about education. We know that he cares about the environment and the impact on the environment for future generations. We know that he cares about inequality and what is going to happen to our young people. So whilst I think that important thing about making that transition to king and being absolutely impartial, we already know that he has those passions and that he will bring that empathy to the way that he is king.
It was very interesting, though, Sir Nicholas, that he also in that speech very carefully drew a line in a way under his time as Prince of Wales. He very clearly said, my charities and causes will be for someone else to take forward. His life will now be taken up with so many of those official duties, like the audiences with prime ministers. He's already had his first one with Liz Truss. How do you think he'll make that transition?
Well, I think he'll make the transition with great ease, because he knows perfectly well what the rules are. And he's had a very long time at the feet of his mother, who, after all, was one of the greatest queens this country has ever had. He would have watched the way that she did it, and he knows exactly the constitutional proprieties. So I think that while some of the issues that Prince Charles, the King, had strong views on, like the environment, are now completely mainstream. They're no longer sort of highly contentious. I mean, you know, the Duke of Edinburgh used to speak very, very powerfully on the environment. But clearly he will never get involved in any form of political controversy.
It was very interesting just to see him with Liz Truss at that meeting, and actually there was more access for cameras. The microphones were able to pick up some of their words. So do you think actually already we're seeing a sort of evolution?
I'm sure we are. You know, I mean, it is inevitable. This is a transition, as Valerie said. This is a real transition from the old to the new, and each monarch presumably makes their own role within the monarchy, but within the very strict conventions which have bound monarchs for all time now.
And talk about evolution and change. I mean, now the Queen Consort, Camilla, by the King's side. Alison, how do you think the public will view that? How do you think they'll see her in that role?
Well, so when it was announced earlier in the year, it was so relatively recently that she was going to take the role.
The Queen made it very plain, didn't she?
Yes, I mean, I think there was some concern around the King, you know, Prince of Wales as he was then, that how this might sit with the public. But actually, I think everybody really feels that she has been an incredible support to him over the last 2 decades since their marriage, and that she is at his side whenever he travels, and that really I think there's been a general acceptance that things change, relationships change, and as long as he's happy and he's got the emotional support to do this, what is going to be an extremely difficult job, then that's okay.
And part of that job, and one of the things he cares about, and the Queen cared so much about, of course, was the Commonwealth. Now, there is some discussion already around about how this transfer might have an effect on countries that are mulling, considering their role in the Commonwealth. We know, Baroness Amos, that Barbados has already become a republic, moves towards that in Jamaica, a little bit of chatter in Australia too about perhaps, not right now, but before too long. Knowing the diplomacy and those networks, what do you think will happen?
Well, I think there are a couple of things. One is that I think we should all remember that as Prince of Wales, King Charles went to Barbados when they made that transition from the Queen being head of state to becoming a republic. And my sense is that he feels very, very strongly that this is a decision for the peoples of those countries, and that the close relationships that we have with those countries, as a result of a shared history and so on, that those relationships can still continue even as those countries make those decisions about who is head of state. And I think we have to be very, very careful not to mix up the decisions that those countries and the people of those countries have every right to make about what our future relationship is in terms of Commonwealth countries more broadly, but also with the rest of the world. You know, our previous prime ministers talked about the important role the Queen played in terms of diplomacy. I think we will see the same with King Charles.
And we'll talk about that a bit more later. It'll be interesting to see how those relationships evolve. But there are also other hugely important things happening in this country at the moment that we'll just briefly touch on. Alison, had this sad event not taken place, we would have been talking endlessly about a huge government intervention in the energy market to help people to help people pay their bills through the winter. We can have a look at how the Sunday Times is covering that this morning. We know that people have been desperately worried about what the next few months might bring. Do you think the government's huge intervention will solve that? Will it be enough?
Well, I think certainly this time last week, that was the only thing that people were talking about. I mean, obviously, perhaps £100 billion has been spent this week, and it's barely got a line in the weekend's papers. But I think what we have to remember is that when this period of mourning is gone, that anxiety in people's lives about how they're going to pay the bills, that will have been reduced. So that is there. I mean, how it's being done is obviously the point for debate. The Prime Minister has sort of refused any form of windfall tax, so we've still got vast profits being made by the energy companies, whereas actually now that this money is going to sit on a national debt, which is going to have to be paid back at some point, but at least the initial anxiety has been taken away from people.
And Sir Nicholas, I mean, as a former Conservative MP, how do you feel about such a massive scale of state intervention, far bigger than the furlough scheme during COVID that cost tens and tens of billions of pounds?
Well, I feel that it was inevitable given the circumstances. I don't think there was any other way of doing it. I think people's fears were entirely justified. The scale of the gas intervention because of the Russian war in Ukraine, rendered it absolutely essential that the government step in. And I think they stepped in very boldly and I agree entirely with Alison. Of course, the big question that remains is how, when this starts being paid back, and we are further loading onto future generations very considerable debt, and it will have to be repaid. So the natural Tory instinct is to not to be so pro it, but there was nothing to do. There was nothing else to do.
Well, I know, in fact, in this studio we'll be talking about that a lot in the weeks and months to come, no doubt about that. But you mentioned there, Sir Nicholas, what has been happening in Ukraine. I mean, Baroness Amos, away from the coverage of the monarchy, Russian troops appear to have abandoned some key towns. It seems that the Ukrainians are suddenly making a lot of progress. We heard here last week from the First Lady of Ukraine that everybody was pinning their hopes on a new advance and a turning point. Do you think we might be seeing that?
Well, I think we all hope so, but we don't know. I mean, there have been various points where we have thought that, there will be some kind of peace deal done, or we may be able to move forward in some kind of positive way. We're not getting any kind of sense from Russia that they are at that point where they want to negotiate. And that's my big worry. I mean, I saw the first stage of this when I worked at the United Nations. And without all of the countries that are involved wanting to come together and wanting to secure some kind of settlement, this terrible, terrible war will continue. But it is really important that the Ukrainians have made key strategic advances here. They have managed to cut off some of the supply lines to the Russian forces. So this may force the Russians to rethink.
And we can see some very powerful images of one of the towns that has been taken back, Balaklia, which is one of the places that's been liberated. And Alison, we've seen, haven't we, some amazing video of people sort of coming out of their houses, greeting the Ukrainian soldiers. I mean, do you think...
It does feel like an amazing step forward. I mean, since we saw the Russian abandonment of Kyiv sort of fairly soon after, this feels like the biggest turning point that we've had up in the northeast of the country there. But that was largely, I think, because the Russians have moved their troops further south towards the Crimea. And I think whilst this is wonderful and we're all looking for sort of some green shoots in this war, we have to also be mindful that Russians are still occupying about 20% of Ukraine, and this will continue to be a very long and painful and bloody war.
It's still a very grave and unpredictable situation.
And let's not forget the human impact of this. I mean, I have seen this in many, many situations, time and time again, and it is absolutely dreadful. The impact on women, children, families, it's people at the heart of this.
Okay, all three of you, thank you very much for now. We'll be back with you a bit later on, and we will hear too, again, from the three Prime Ministers with some of their personal memories, some very funny ones about their times with the late Queen. But David Cameron told us that Her late Majesty had been the world's greatest diplomat, and we can see how her death has been marked right around the world. Here we can see the Sydney Opera House lit up in tribute, the Brandenburg Gate in Berlin, the New York skyline, Ottawa in Canada, even the remarkable monument that overlooks Rio in Brazil. Many cities around the world have been specially lit in her memory. Her Majesty's diplomacy was both powerful in public, but also personal. No more so maybe than for the Kennedy family. The young American president and his wife Jackie came to meet the Queen in 1961. But after his death, Britain granted an acre of land at Runnymede, where the Magna Carta was signed, to the United States as a permanent memorial to John F. Kennedy. At the ceremony was a 7-year-old Caroline Kennedy, his daughter, now the United States ambassador to Australia. I've been speaking to her about what she remembers from that unique event.
I think for Americans, the Queen has been a constant presence in our lives. We feel very connected to Britain and, of course, to the royal family, having watched them over so many years, and with the knowledge that our alliance goes back so far and is the most enduring and partnership. We share values, and certainly the Queen embodied those values. Her commitment to democracy, her sense of obligation, her steadfastness, her warmth.
And what did she mean to you and your family with their various meetings and connections over the years?
Well, my grandfather was ambassador to the court of St. James's when her father was king. And so my parents' generation, my aunts and uncles, my father, all spent time in London before the war and studied that period of British history. My father was such an admirer of England and had so many close relationships there. And certainly the service in the war that the Queen performed, that my father and his sister and brother made them all part of the same generation.
And in 1965, the Queen dedicated a memorial here in the UK to your father. You were there with your mother and your brother at the ceremony. Can you tell us a bit about what you remember?
This memorial is an acre of land at Runnymede, which is where the Magna Carta was signed, obviously. And but I think that it really represented the foundation of democracy. And so for the Queen, for the British people to donate that in memory of President Kennedy and our joint commitment to democracy, to freedom, to a constitutional government was something that was so significant, so unprecedented.
The British government of that day resolved to establish here a memorial to be at Runnymede for centuries to come. Presented to Her Majesty were persons closely connected with the memorial appeal. The little Kennedy children took every eye.
What are your memories of the tribute?
Well, I was just 7, so I do remember that we were taken to Windsor Castle for lunch before we went to Runnymede. And it was me and my brother and my little cousins. And so I do remember that that the grown-ups had a more formal lunch, but we were able to have running races in the hallway to keep us busy before we went to the formal ceremony. But certainly it was something that I was aware was incredibly meaningful to my mother, especially. And it was a very solemn sort of moment. And I think I remember it in a way that I don't remember kind of my father's funeral, but it was something that all my aunts and uncles, I think, deeply, deeply appreciated.
And do you remember, was it King Charles in the running races or Princess Anne or Andrew?
Well, amazingly enough, I can't remember that.
And what do you think that all meant to your mother? Did she treasure those memories?
Throughout her life, she had these very special programs printed. This is the one I have that was mine of the occasion, which is inscribed by my mother. It says, to Caroline, who came to Runnymede when she was 7 years old, and it has the program, and then it has all the remarks, including Her Majesty's speech, as well as other dignitaries, both British and American. So I think it was always these were always the most treasured things in our house, and so it was nice to be able to see them again today.
And that amazing state visit, those amazingly glamorous images when your parents came to the UK in 1961, what do you think that was like for them?
It was part of the trip to Europe, Paris, Vienna, where my father met Khrushchev, and then they came to London, where my aunt and uncle were living, and my cousin has just born, so there was a christening. So again, it was a combination of family and official moments on that trip. But I think obviously the most important or exciting was the visit to Buckingham Palace. And my mother was a great scrapbook and great archivist and collector of memory. And so she has this scrapbook of her time with my father, as well as one for each of us. And so in it, the pages are yellow and the photographs are falling out, but it's, this picture of them at the state visit. And then I think they had, a wonderful time.
Now, you've served as an ambassador to Japan and now Australia. How would you describe the Queen's role as a diplomat?
She obviously was an incredibly skilled diplomat and leader, and a constant presence that was able to provide continuity in terms of these issues over time. And I think people really looked to her for a sense of what was right and where things were headed, and to sometimes make more gentle the political conflicts of a time.
Ambassador Caroline Kennedy, thanks so much for speaking to us. A peek there in Jackie Kennedy's scrapbooks. It was amazing to hear about her personal experiences, but also Baroness Amos, her focus on the Queen as a diplomat. Now, you are a diplomat. You've been in presence of her late Majesty on many occasions. What difference did it make?
Her experience and the things that she had seen made an enormous difference. And I certainly know, not only from my conversations with her, but my conversations with others, that she actually gave leaders around the world the confidence to do things that sometimes they thought they would not get through because they were so hard. Because she was able to give them a little gentle advice. They knew that this would not become public in any way. And people listened to her. And it wasn't just heads of the Commonwealth, it's heads from countries across the world. So that experience that she had, that light touch, that ability just to give a little nudge, was extraordinarily helpful for them, but also for us in terms of the relationship between Britain and other countries.
And just briefly, can you give us an example of something that might not have happened were it not for her involvement, that little nudge?
I don't think that would be fair.
Okay, well, I don't want you to divulge any confidences that you don't feel able to do, but you've given us a sense of how crucial her role sometimes was. But I think also she was a true sort of diplomatic celebrity. I mean, I remember the G7 summit in Cornwall last year. President Macron, Angela Merkel, all these world leaders practically trampling over each other in order to be pictured next to the Queen, who made them all laugh, who put them at their ease. But Sir Nicholas, do you think King Charles will have that same kind of star power?
I think he will. First of all, he is already in his own right an accomplished diplomat. I mean, the amount of travelling he's done, the people he's met, he has built relationships which, as Barry knows, these relationships are sometimes not possible for the government to have very closely. And there are several very senior figures around the world who have a very strong personal relationship with the King, and I think that will now be developed. And I think as our life goes on, and in the years to come, as we rebuild our British foreign policy after Brexit, I think he will have a very, very important role to play, bringing people together. And one thing that is absolutely unique about the King is that he is the first Prince of Wales and the first one to ever use this astonishing convening power of being able to get people together. I mean, he has that in spades. It's an extraordinary ability. People will come. They always came when he's Prince of Wales, and they will certainly come now when he's King.
And Laura, just one thing to add, if I may. diplomacy is about trust.
Yeah.
And the Queen had it, and King Charles has it precisely because of those relationships that you talked about.
Okay, well, people who certainly trusted Her late Majesty, and the person who will have to build a relationship of trust with the King, of course, is the Prime Minister. The ceremony of the next week has been so carefully choreographed. At 10 o'clock today, the coffin of Her late Majesty will be taken from Balmoral, and the BBC has a special programme to cover that journey. Let's show you the scene there as preparations are being made. It sounds like a real hush at the gates, piles and piles of flowers from well-wishers who've arrived there in the last couple of days. But Balmoral, a place that was so important to the Queen and the royal family, a symbol of their connection with Scotland, and a place where she spent time, not just with friends and family, but with her prime ministers over the years. David Cameron, Gordon Brown and Theresa May have shared some of their memories of those trips and the reflections of the monarch they knew so well.
Well, the first thing was that it was just the most extraordinary privilege to spend an hour every week with, you know, really the world's greatest public servant, someone who's been on the throne for so long, who had so much experience, who'd met every world leader, who'd travelled to every country, and I was her 12th Prime Minister. So as you explained why, you know, the economy wasn't growing or this bit of public service wasn't working, you thought to yourself, she's literally heard all this before. She's heard every excuse in the book. But it was an immense privilege. And what you found was not only was she a great listener, but also sage counsel and advice and brilliant questions. And what you found, I found at the end of the hour, you'd walk out of that room, there's no one there taking notes, there's no one else with you. The world's problems hadn't changed, your problems hadn't changed, but you felt you were better equipped to deal with them.
It turns into a conversation. It's not a sort of debriefing. It is a conversation about issues, because the Queen does her homework, did her homework. She would read her red boxes, she would read government papers, she would know what was going on, and of course she had tremendous experience of issues and of people.
Did she ever lead you to change your mind, wittingly or unwittingly?
Well, I can't reveal any particular conversations, but I think the great thing is, yes, that coming from a slightly different angle, from a slightly different perspective, can make you think. I hadn't sort of looked at that quite as closely as maybe I need to.
And what's the best advice she ever gave you?
Well, everything you say to her and everything she says to you is obviously private. But I think she was a believer that in order to make good decisions, you have to try and make sure your life is in good equilibrium, that your family are happy, that your home life is stable, that you get some sleep from time to time, that you're ready to face the next challenges.
I never had any advice, and she wouldn't give that, but she would listen, she would ask questions, she would be endlessly knowledgeable about everything happening in the Commonwealth. I was very embarrassed one day because I went in to see her at 6 o'clock, and I didn't know that one of the Commonwealth leaders had been ousted and that a new government had been formed, and she was telling me what was happening when I was supposed to report to her. And even on British affairs, you know, I'd been in the House of Commons all afternoon, we'd been endless debates or cabinet meetings or something, and she, I think, had been watching television. She was getting notes from her secretaries, and she actually knew better about what was happening to the country than I was. It was quite embarrassing, but it just showed how conscientious she was, how well up on the detail, and I think right to the last. And you could see that in the meeting she had with Liz Truss when she became Prime Minister and Boris Johnson when she left, that she fulfilled her duties right up until the end. But she listened and she asked questions. And remember, famously, she asked, you know, why have these bankers got it all wrong in 2008? But she would never impose her will. And this is the modern monarchy. And I think she set the tone for what King Charles and other monarchs will do.
Did she ever change your mind?
I think in the Commonwealth, yes. I mean, she was so supportive of the Commonwealth. One of her great friends, and probably the two greatest leaders at the time, were herself and Nelson Mandela, and they had a great relationship. And I knew Mandela well, and he used to tell me these stories. You know, when he talked to the Queen and phoned her up from South Africa, you know, we would have said, "Your Majesty, ma'am, how are you?" He said, "Hello, Elizabeth. How's the Duke?" I mean, these were the words he actually used.
To you, how important was it to have a monarch who was a woman through the 20th century and into the 21st?
At a time when a woman was not expected to be in a leadership role, when the husband was expected to be the dominant individual, and Prince Philip, of course, who could have succeeded in so many different types of areas of life, put himself one step behind and was always in support of her. I think it was hugely important. I was asked a little while ago why it was that the United Kingdom had at that stage 2 female prime ministers, now a 3rd. And I said, I'm not sure what it is about the UK, except perhaps that we have had a woman on the throne for so many years. So people don't have any hang-ups about a woman being in that leadership position.
It's said that part of her sense of humour was sometimes to do impersonations. I've read that sometimes she impersonated you. Did she ever do that in front of you? Is that true? Is that scurrilous?
Never in front of me, but I think a Scottish accent's not too difficult to do. And I was with Rory Bremner last week, and we were saying that, you know, it's so easy to impersonate a Scottish accent. So I don't know how well she did it, but I'm sure it was probably making me sound dour, and I don't know.
Now, at one point, you had to apologise to the Queen. For telling, I think it was Michael Bloomberg, who said she had pared down the phone when you told her the result of the Scottish independence referendum. What was it like having to apologise to the Queen?
Well, it was a very upfront and very fulsome apology done very quickly at the beginning of an audience, and I think that's all I should say. But from ever onwards, I've been more careful when cameras and microphones are around, and I learnt my lesson.
Did she tell you off?
Obviously, everything said at those meetings is entirely private.
She also, for Prime Ministers, traditionally would invite you and your families also to Balmoral. And what was that like?
She made you completely at home. And there was a barbecue she organised for everybody on the Saturday night. And she would actually drive you to this barbecue, which was miles away, and you had to go through different estates, open and close gates and everything. And she was in the driving seat. She was actually at the wheel, and I was sitting next to her. Sarah was behind her, and I think at that stage it was the moderator of the Church of Scotland. So we were all in this car, and she was driving. And then we arrived at this small place for the barbecue, and there was Prince Philip, and he was doing the cooking. And she started setting the table and providing the plates.
I remember going for a walk with Samantha and getting completely lost, and this car turns up and the Duke of Edinburgh winds down the window and goes, "Prime Minister, you're completely lost, aren't you?" And I had to say, yes, I was. But going up from Balmoral up into the moors, where the Queen and Prince Philip would cook and make you dinner. He did the barbecue and she laid the table, and I'm not making this up, and served the food and cleared the plates. Seeing her in that very informal setting and talking about everything in life and politics and beyond, that's a sort of unforgettable memory and a huge privilege.
It was one of the picnics which was taking place in one of the bothies in the Balmoral estate, and the hampers of food had come from the castle, and everybody was mucking in, all the guests were mucking in with the royal family to put the food on the table. And I picked up some cheese, I put it on the plate, and I went to transfer it to the table, and the cheese fell on the floor. So I had a split-second decision. And I picked up the cheese and I put it on the plate and I put it on the table. And then I looked around and realised that standing there watching my every move was Her Majesty the Queen. And I looked at her and she looked at me and she just smiled.
So the Queen perhaps was a believer in the 30-second rule. That
I think maybe she was, yes.
She met my sons for the first time, and they were very young at this time. And it was just after lunch, and we came out into the courtyard, and all her corgis came out with her. And suddenly the first words my children heard from the Queen talking to her corgis was, "Shut up!" And they couldn't believe this, amazement. And every time, of course, we upbraided them in the next few months and said, "You've got to behave yourself." He said, "Even the Queen says shut up. We can say that too." And that just showed how human and what a wonderful person she was. And she was so keen to make people feel at home. And she could have acted as if she was above us, but actually she was alongside us. And I think that's what the British people feel.
Now, I have to say, I've interviewed all three of those politicians quite a few times. I have never seen them, Nicholas Soames, light up like that with those very personal memories. Today, of course, is a sombre day, and in a few minutes on BBC One, we'll see the beginning of the journey as the Queen's coffin leaves Balmoral. But, Sir Nicholas, finally to you, what will your abiding memory of Her late Majesty be?
Her grace, her warmth, and I'm inexpressibly proud that I had the honour to know her just a little bit. But you were never, her aura, you were never in any doubt that you were in the presence of the sovereign. And yet she managed to maintain this extraordinary familiarity with her people, an understanding of them and they of her, but without forever one moment surrendering the mystique of monarchy.
And she loved your grandfather.
She did love him. He loved her. He loved her. He'd known her since she was a child, and he loved her very much indeed. He revered her.
Sir Nicholas Soames, thank you so much for sharing your recollections. I know it's a very difficult few days actually for you as a personal friend of the royal family. Thank you so much to all three of you for being with us this morning. And as our time today comes to a close, I feel, perhaps you feel too, that we understand now a bit more about one of the threads that ties our unwritten constitution to real life, because we've heard from three people who've lived in Number 10, who've shared a bit of how the private conversations they had at the palace helped them, challenged them too, as they made the decisions that affect us all. And we've heard their hopes for how the monarchy will endure and evolve. Now, in a moment, as we've been saying, we'll take you to Balmoral, where Her Majesty's coffin will shortly start its long last journey. But from time to time here on Sunday mornings, there'll be a moment for something different, maybe something unashamedly beautiful. So this morning, we will close with music from the violinist Tamsin Waley-Cohen, who played for the Queen at the age of just 8 and shared her talent with King Charles II. Thank you to Tamsin for playing a stunning piece of music from hundreds of years ago for this, a day of history. And thank you to our guest this morning. And thank you also to you for being with us. You can, as always, catch up with anything on the iPlayer, perhaps those reflections from 3 of the Queen's Prime Ministers that will be there too. Now, I will see you next week. But now we will join Jane Hill for coverage of Queen Elizabeth's final journey. Jane.